what we've been taught about the way our government works and the way banks and finance works is wrong, and that we are at a point where not only are we challenging all of these establishment people politically, establishment people who rely on lobbyists and big money and simply have these centrist ideals, establishment people, like Tony Blair that took us to war. We're doing all this work to challenge these establishment people who sometimes even call themselves center left or liberal or whatever. If we're doing that politically, well, then we also need to do that with the way we think about economics. There's no other way around that.
That's great, it starts with the sovereign state deciding that it needs to make green new jobs and high-speed trains.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to episode 14 of the Modern Monetary Theory podcast. You just heard our guest this week, Green New Deal advocate and scholar Andrés Bernal. Andrés is a longtime friend and advisor to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and was instrumental in connecting her to MMT activists and scholars. So we'll be talking to Andrés about the recent history of the Green New Deal and an article he co-authored with Stephanie Kelton, and also the MMT job guarantee and more. By the way, you just heard the first bit of a song that I recorded about MMT. There'll be a SoundCloud link to that song in the show notes, and also I'll upload it as a bonus episode. Let me know what you think, but only if you're able to be nice about it, because I'm very delicate. Anyway, back to the podcast. On the topic of the job guarantee, episodes 4, 5 and 11 of our podcast with Fidel Kaboub, Rowan Gray and Bill Mitchell respectively are good listening if you want to understand more about the MMT job guarantee and why it's part of MMT rather than an optional extra. And also how the job guarantee can work with basic income schemes as distinct from universal basic income, which most if not all MMT economists have indicated would lead to inflation and continued inequality. As ever, if this raises any questions for you, please get in touch on Twitter at MMT Podcast, or there's a list of other ways to get in touch at the end of the show. We try to answer what we can and direct you to other people when we can't. Thanks for your patience, your support, and the time you put into understanding MMT. Okay, let's dive in. Hi, Andrés Bernal. Thanks for coming on the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Just to give people a little bit of background, I met Andrés at the MMT conference in New York last year, and it was a fantastic experience to meet so many progressives from the US working for the Modern Money Network, for which you have been working with Rowan Gray. Is that right?
That is correct, yeah.
And you gave a really lovely story back then about how your lovely friend, a girl called Alexandria, happened to be motivated by the current political environment and wanted to run for elections. And you had known her for a while, and she came into contact with the Modern Money Network at that point. Can you tell us a little bit about how it happened? How MMT became involved in her campaign, etc.?
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of a crazy story. It seems like all the stars aligned around 2017. What happened was that, so her and I have been friends for years and years now. And after Trump's election, right, like everybody was depressed and kind of trying to figure out what to do. And, it seemed like a very dire situation. Mm-hmm. And when I moved to New York City, she was one of the first people, she was one of the only people that I knew out here at first when I got here. And we would hang out and stuff and, talk about how, she always would mention that she felt like she had this bigger purpose and she had to do something and really important, but we didn't quite know what. After Trump's election, we kind of would organize friends and have discussions, and even there was conversations around having a podcast. And eventually, she went to Standing Rock, which was I don't know if your viewers would all know, or your listeners, I'm sorry, a time where there was a pipeline that was going to get passed in a part of the United States and through an indigenous community. So there were a lot of protests, and it was really. national news.
The DAPL pipeline.
Yes, correct. So she went over there, and she had a very profound, transformative experience with a lot of the indigenous communities. And when she came back, she was ready to run. And at that point, she had been supported by Justice Democrats. So the kind of interesting thing is, around the same time, I was slowly meeting all of the big characters in the modern money network. I began researching modern monetary theory right after the 2016 election and getting familiar with it myself.
So that's quite recent then.
Yeah, it was. It kind of was. The insights are something that I always figured it worked in somewhat of a similar way. I just didn't know really the details, and I hadn't been exposed to modern money as a theoretical body yet. I actually came to it through the solidarity economy and worker cooperatives and economic sociology and that sort of thing, and that's how I found it after the election. So I befriended Rowan Gray and a bunch of Raul, Nathan, and a bunch of the other characters in the network. Mm-hmm. So I would mention it to Alexandria every now and then, but it wasn't that big of a deal. And then eventually, as her campaign grew and she started becoming more popular, it also coincided with my understanding of MMT growing, developing, and I kind of reached a conclusion at one point that it was going to be the perspective, the lens, and the framework that modern money offers was going to be the thing that we needed to break through like this neoliberal hellhole that we're currently in, this kind of ideological prison that we're in. So I think it really started to come together after an event that I spoke at for her, and we were sitting down, and somebody asked me if I was for universal basic income, or I think she asked me that, and I said, I used to be, but I'm not really anymore, and they were kind of confused, and I said, well, I think I found this other thing that's much more effective at reaching our goals. It's called the federal jobs guarantee, and they asked me to tell them more. And I started to talk about it, and it's just so happened that there was a conference. I think it was called the New Deal. There was a conference at the New School and at Columbia the next weekend, and she went. And Stephanie Kelton, Derek Hamilton, Randall Ray, Matthew Forstater, Pavlina, all of these people were on panels at this conference. So she took down some notes, and quite soon thereafter, the federal jobs guarantee was on her platform in her campaign. This was still before the primary. So that kind of got really popular. And all of a sudden, you had people like Cory Booker, Kristen Gillibrand, who are now presidential candidates, all with federal jobs guarantee platforms. And
I'm sure at that time you must have had some debates between the job guarantee and the UBI. And I'm pleased to hear that the job guarantee picked up where the UBI didn't.
Yeah, I had some debates with some other of the volunteers and people in the campaign about it. A good friend of mine now, we kind of went at it for a while that night, all in good faith. But I think what made more sense for her district, for her constituency, and from the history of her kind of study and fascination with the legacy of civil rights and Martin Luther King, I mean, the jobs guarantee is right, is an extension of this legacy and this tradition. So it was kind of a natural fit, I think.
So did it feel perhaps the jobs guarantee felt because of the FDR and Martin Luther King connection, like a dream that never came true and finally had its time? Yes.
That, the whole idea of the Second Bill of Rights, all of that seemed to just align quite naturally with her inclinations and mine as well. For me, what did it for me, because I used to be much more into universal basic income, but what did it for me was this idea of transforming work, work starting to evolve from something that's very alienating and quite exploitative to something that could be potentially grounded in community, grounded in our skills, something that could be supportive and that could put pressure on a lot of these private firms to either improve their working conditions significantly or also act as kind of a baseline for more worker-owned cooperatives and democratic firms to emerge out of. So I kind of see it from that perspective as well.
Could you just walk us through your journey from being a UBI advocate to a job guarantee advocate? Because having been both of those things, you know the arguments on both sides. So it'd be quite useful to hear that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I came at UBI in the beginning from a perspective of like, why do we even work? Like, work is just essentially this incredibly negative thing. I wish I could just get paid and philosophize and drink wine all day.
I think a lot of people would identify with that sentiment, particularly now. I mean, that, you know.
Well, as a podcaster, I can't relate to that at all. I don't know.
If it was up to us, we'd do this podcast all day.
It was certainly my dream. Kind of like let the robots take over, and then we'll just have these philosophical symposiums or whatnot.
You're a philosopher on your... did you study philosophy? Is that where this comes from?
Exactly.
Of course, the listener can't hear this, but Andrés is wearing a Chelsea top. So, anyway,
he knows his audience.
Yeah.
I do, yes. That's right. I love the UK.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's probably easy to love from over there, mate.
Vice versa, right?
Yes.
So go ahead. Sorry.
So I was being challenged on it by some people, but really when Rowan and some of the others started explaining to me the bigger vision of a jobs guarantee, I started to question things because, well, number one, I mean, there's a lot of work to do. Our societies are very broken environmentally and socially. And I just kind of started to reflect on this really privileged position that I had as this person getting graduate degrees and talking about like not needing to work when there's so much to do in communities and to transform our energy systems, our food systems, our agriculture. There's so much, here in the United States, there's a mental health crisis, an addiction crisis, and that means work not in the sense that we traditionally think of it, but really in the sense of care and the sense of solidarity, in the sense of giving people attention, in the sense of hearing people out, listening, and providing a lot of the human connection and the attention to our neighborhoods and our cities that we're not getting right now. So that's when I kind of started to question it and started to think, look, it really sounds to me like a jobs guarantee is a way to operationalize the goals of the UBI, so that we're getting that base wage, that living wage, but we're also provided with the infrastructure to do something with it, to do something that we want to do something that is that emerges from our skills and our abilities. And also, there's kind of this really important idea that human beings need to be doing something with one another. I think to feel socially enlightened or developed or whatnot, to flourish, right? And I think like wage labor and some of the most exploitative and alienating parts of capitalism strip that away from us. So that's when my mind started to really change. And I mean, of course, I think that, and I haven't met anybody that's for a jobs guarantee that doesn't also think that those who may not be able to work for whatever reason, whether it be disability or students, shouldn't receive a living income. So, we also support that, right? It's just that. Yeah,
I always think when you meet a UBI person, you say, what, should everybody get it? And quite quickly we realize what they're actually talking about is basic income, because, it's like, oh yeah, everybody should get it, but then it gets clawed back through tax and yada, yada. And it's like, so they're already talking about basic income. And then the other thing that always gets missed in these job guarantee versus UBI discussions is the job guarantee as an automatic stabilizer.
Yeah, I think that's when like I really started to commit myself to the jobs guarantee and more broadly the principles of modern money, and that's when I kind of realized that as it's been proposed so far, it really seems like a UBI would put us in a situation where these monopoly tech companies kind of produce all of society's value, have control and have ownership of everything, and then the rest of us kind of get these scraps and are not actively participating in the construction of value in our society, and that's I think that's very, very problematic. So
the thing is, people at this point, and they do have a point, is that people do want to work. They're naturally enterprising, but at the same time, for me, is about the job guarantee includes an element of recognition of the work that a person is doing as being intrinsically adding value to society. Whereas a UBI basically says, you decide whatever you want to do, regardless of whether it adds value or not. Chances are a lot of the things people do will add value, but there's no system of recognition. And I think that poses a risk of being divisive and of particularly I see this from the perspective of women. Women, are likely to be told, oh, just do housework, does not work.
What I'd really like to be able to do is just unpack the article that you co-wrote with Stephanie Kelton for the Huffington Post. Now that I'm going to get the title right. We Can Pay for a Green New Deal. So you can just Google that if you're listening. That's on the Huffington Post. We Can Pay for a Green New Deal. And first of all, let's just talk about the Green New Deal. And for the rest of the world who aren't in the US, what the words New Deal mean to Americans.
Well, to us, it means saving the country when it was collapsing. And when fascism was rising all around the world. The New Deal is when American society was fundamentally transformed in an effort to rebuild and redefine who we are. With that said, there were a lot of promises that were left unkept by the New Deal, given the situation at the moment where United States in particular, the U.S. was still a very segregated and racist country at the time. So there was really a struggle where there was this movement and demand for the United States government to unleash these programs that were attempting to put an end to the Depression, mobilize the country's workforce to rebuild through all these public work programs, provide relief for the most vulnerable. But then at the same time, there were forces that were kind of trying to limit the scope of the New Deal and exclude a lot of marginalized populations, including the Black community and others as well, women too. So it's this kind of like really important part of our history that I think saved the nation, but also provided the groundwork in a lot of ways for what would become then the civil rights movement to kind of take the next step in trying to make this a better society.
And as you know, you are having the little whatever efforts you guys have done over these years, and the kind of the merging with Alexandria is having a big influence here, and we're very happy about that. But there have been various versions of the Green New Deal over many years, and many economists claim ownership of the original idea. But this Green New Deal is different, not the least because it contains the job guarantee. And I'd like to know how you see it, one being intrinsically, part of the other. Why is the job guarantee so important to the Green New Deal, and why is MMT so important to the Green New Deal?
And also, if you want to, you could just start at the beginning and just say, lay out as well as you can in the time we've got what the Green New Deal is.
Right. Okay. So a lot of important pieces. And
yeah, I know. Take your time.
And it's really interesting because the story of the way a lot of our work in the modern money network and our allies, the way that it connects with Alexandria's campaign and now her office is very connected to this, right? Because after the jobs guarantee got on her platform, I kind of began to emphasize more the importance of heterodox perspectives to macroeconomics and to fiscal policy, essentially. And I tried to facilitate at that time a lot of conversations and relationship building between her and her team and people like Stephanie Kelton, Pavlina, and that kind of grew and developed. So she was always interested in the Green New Deal being something that she came out of the gate with. Because I think to our generation, climate change is just like this really, really urgent thing that has never received the kind of respect and attention that it so needs. And it's just, it's a really, really terrifying and depressing thing. Mm. So it was just on her agenda to come out right away. So I think a lot of us realize that it was just fundamental in order to avoid some of the same mistakes and the pitfalls that other policy initiatives fall under or fall into because of the kind of policy and economic paradigm that we're so stuck in. Yeah, I mean, growing up, everything and any idea that sounded kind of interesting and might it might improve our society always comes up against this question of like, well, how are you going to pay for that? And it's going to be unsustainable and the deficit and all this kind of stuff. And it's just been a really effective way at controlling what the left is able to do and what progressives are able to do. And then what's most absurd to me is when the left themselves have so internalized neoliberalism that they come out with arguing that they're going to be better at
reducing the deficit. Yeah, I know.
Well, in a way, it's almost like they're against austerity, but they're using the language that leads one back to austerity every single time.
I always say the phrase "I'm socially progressive, but I'm a fiscal conservative" is the new "I'm not racist, but."
Yes, right.
It's the economics. I'm not, I'm a fiscal conservative. It's like, yeah, you're a conservative then. Yeah, you have to be.
I think the narrative here, I don't know how much about UK politics you're familiar with, but we have this Tory party, which is the equivalent of your GOP. And they've been targeting reducing the deficit for the last 10 years, and that has served as an excuse, as you know, to do a lot of to retreat the state, to cut a lot to public services, cut welfare, etc. Now, the narrative the left is doing, they're basic, and the Tories haven't been too successful at their targets. They've moved their deficit targets back quite often. And what the left has come up with saying is, look, we are going to, we're not going to do cuts, we're not going to do this, we're not going to be cruel, we're going to be nice. And at the same time, we're going to meet the same targets that you are with the deficits. And it's like, no, you have to let go.
And it just puts us in such a vulnerable position to always get, eviscerated by the right, because you just can't win when you're in that paradigm. And so as the Green New Deal was getting more and more popular, it seemed like something had to be done to come out in the public, at least from our academic perspective, to affirm that we don't have to play by those rules anymore. And also, in addition to that, even on the left, there was kind of like this confusion around what to do. There were all these ideas about creating new institutions, creating a network of public banks, designing all of these different things that will pay for the Green New Deal. And that, to a lot of us, that felt like, why are you trying to, take all of these weird turns and create all these new things and fight all these extra battles and make things a lot more complicated when literally the survival of human beings on this planet is at stake here. And literally when it's so much more simple than that, just by understanding these principles. So I think that was when the team got together, and it all started with a tweet from another friend of mine who tweeted at the work that's being done at Data for Progress, which they're doing some great work on a lot of progressive policy. And they had written a proposal on the Green New Deal. So my friend tweeted at them, my friend Alan, and he said, hey, great work on this. You all should also speak to these people here and talk about fiscal policy. So we did. We ended up speaking to the Data for Progress people, and in particular an author, Greg Carlock, and made the decision to join forces essentially and write an article with Stephanie Kelton. So we put that together. It all happened really quickly. It happened like in a week's time or something. And it went out, it got published, and it was just like this big hit, right? And so in that article, we argue that there's this urgency around climate change. We know that. We know what the UN is saying. We know what needs to be done. And one of the big obstacles is this idea of quote unquote paying for it and how to finance it. And so in that article, we kind of present the basics of saying that a government like the United States that has full financial sovereignty doesn't need to find the money somewhere because they're the currency issuer and they have a monopoly on the US dollar. So from there, we kind of, a lot of people stop there. When people first learned about MMT, and a lot of the critics out there, they kind of just stop there and they think all we're saying is that we have infinite money. And there's all kinds of distortions of what we're talking about, and all these misunderstandings. And it's just because people don't want to take the time to actually read what's there. Because what we do in the article is we go from that, making that point that the United States government will never run out of money. It will never default. We go from there to say the real limits, the importance of this conversation is around what is technically possible from the perspective of real biophysical resources. What do we have? What do we have available in terms of labor? What do we have available in terms of technology, in terms of resources, et cetera? So it's an attempt to move the conversation from balancing the budget to balancing the economy itself, right? And so that's kind of the core of the article.
Just to lift a line out of the article, which I think is a great way to say MMT. I obviously we don't like to make things too simple, but this is a nice simple way of saying it. Anything that is technically feasible is financially affordable, and it won't be a drag on the economy.
Exactly.
There are sadly big objections to that very line over here. So we still have our battles, unfortunately.
And people will up like, well, what about Zimbabwe? What about the Weimar Republic? What about Venezuela? Right. And so nobody wants to pay attention to the thing that we've been emphasizing, which is that many countries around the world don't have this full financial sovereignty that the United States has. And it's not just because of some natural random reason. No, it's designed that way politically. A lot of the developing world is in a state of dependence towards larger, more powerful nations. And so they just cannot use the full capacity of their currency and whatnot. Others, unfortunately, it's by really poorly thought out policy choice, as we see in the European Union. The way that so many of the countries have been stripped away of their capacity to also use their own currency, or also just the absence of any desire to use fiscal policy in the EU, right? So,
yeah. I mean, all of these negative things that you're talking about, MMT explains them.
Right.
In the case of the Eurozone countries, it's because they don't have the financial, the monetary sovereignty. They gave that up to the European Central Bank. In the case of Zimbabwe, they trashed their supply. Their ability for their economy was downgraded by about 80%, and corruption.
Yeah, and we've also discussed in the past in the podcast about Latin America. Andres, you are from Colombia.
That's right.
Born there?
Yes.
We have a bit of a football rivalry going on. But so to me, being from Peru, MMT, it doesn't put me in Peru in the same position of freedom as the States or the UK has, but it does show a way forward. And that's his value to me.
So
yeah.
So getting back to the article, here's a phrase. The federal government can spend money on public priorities without raising revenue, and it won't wreck the nation's economy to do so. That may sound radical, but it's not. It's how the US economy has been functioning for nearly half a century. That's the power of the public purse. Could you say more about that?
Yes, right. So there's this assumption that in order for us in the United States, for this example, that we need to find the money somewhere, that we need to raise taxes to be able to have some revenue, or that we need to cut spending from somewhere else in order to be able to accomplish any of these progressive goals, or really anything, right? But this is kind of saying the way the system already operates is that Congress just authorizes a budget, and the accounts get credited, the money goes out, right? People, no checks are going to bounce. The Federal Reserve is going to make sure that no checks will ever bounce. The question, though, the important question is like, when the spending happens, do we need to think about inflation, right? So when I mentioned before the resource constraints, right, this is kind of like a basic understanding of MMT, which is to say that inflation can be can set the limits to what we can spend. So once we spend, then we can talk about like moving forward. Do we need some kind of offsets? Do we need to tackle inflation in some places by designing policy to do different things, right? And there's a whole list of different ways that we can approach that problem. And I think something that's interesting too is to think about the way that private finance contributes to inflation, particularly in the United States. Wall Street and so many of these industries, from higher education to housing to healthcare, to energy, to food and agriculture, the way that the system is designed to be so dependent upon private finance and speculation and whatnot contributes a lot of inflationary pressures on the U.S. And so one way to reduce inflation, if that's slowly becoming a problem, is, of course, to raise taxes after we're already engaged in like this project for public purpose. But it's not the only way. It's not the only way. So I think that's an important part of the conversation, that we could also address some of the ways that private speculation and private profit is harming the economy.
But in terms of even in terms of controlling inflation, I mean, it matters what you're spending on, of course, because some spending is actually deflationary.
Exactly.
But at the same time, if you're going to tackle inflation, it matters what you're taxing.
I do think people have, from what I've seen online, they've also dipped out. You know how you said, people dip out after you tell them, the government can spend whatever it wants in dollars because it produces dollars, and they tend to leave it there and think, this is all, they just hang on that and they think that's MMT in its entirety. If you get them beyond that, the next thing is, then you explain that taxes function to regulate aggregate demand, and people go, and then they duck out there and go, well, that's ridiculous because you're not going to be able to like pass the motions that you need to pass, and it's bringing it. We don't trust Congress to do the right thing.
They're just looking for excuses to duck out there. So it is worth talking about those other mechanisms by which aggregate demand is controlled, because MMT doesn't say taxes only function to drive the currency. They also function to regulate aggregate demand. They also function to make society more just as well. But the way modern money people understand it is, that's. They don't necessarily have to do that, but they definitely necessarily control aggregate demand.
Absolutely.
So those other things we're talking about, a lot of the time in this discourse about the Green New Deal, World War II comes up. We're facing a challenge that's as big as World War II, and our nation, the UK, the US, we spent loads of money, and there was no money around in World War II. And people think, that's because you sold bonds. and got money, but they completely missed. No, there was no money. There was no, the bonds were there to actually cool down aggregate demand. Am I right about that, Andres?
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot there.
Sorry, yeah. Sorry, this is the first conversation I've had all day, so I should empty the answer machine a bit more often.
So one of the things also that we touch on the article is this idea of deficits, and it's a big part of MMT as well. And that's to say that obviously, and just like this little idea is so important, right? A government is not like a household. We are currency users, people. We need to find incomes. Businesses need to find income somewhere. State and local governments need to find income, and the government does not. So I remember one time recently, I was having brunch with a friend of mine, and I used the Stephanie Kelton example. I said, if I'm the government and you're a person in the economy, and I spend 10, and then I tax 9, what's my deficit? And he kind of realized then that the government deficit is his surplus, is what he has, is his savings. And it just clicked, like, oh my God, like I've been obsessing over this thing. It doesn't make any sense, right? And then the other example I like to use as well is to talk about like an airline providing frequent flyer miles. Airlines provide these frequent flyer miles. They're never going to run out of frequent flyer miles.
Yeah. Where do they get them from?
Yeah, they neither have, this is something that Warren Mosler likes to say, I think. They neither have them nor they don't have them. It's just a tool used to coordinate coordinate consumption, production, etc. But the interesting thing is, like in this example, if an airline were to give just way too many frequent flyer miles that exceeded the capacity of planes to hold passengers, then you would have a problem. And I think like that is something that people understand. That's helped a lot.
Great example.
Yeah. It would go worthless. Yeah.
But this is the thing that MMT does. So in that example about it matters what you tax and it matters what you spend on. Most economists, even progressive ones these days, don't think about it in terms of resources. They think about it in terms of financing, spending.
Right.
And they think that as long as they match a pound of tax or $1 of tax with a pound of spending or a pound of or $1 of spending, then somehow inflation will fix itself. Or that's the way things work. They're looking at things from the side of the financing the government, what the central bank does. They're not looking where they should be looking, which is at how resources are being utilized, the real stuff that we depend on. And the Green New Deal, that I think becomes more relevant when we start thinking about the limited resources that the earth has, the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another consequence of how powerful this neoliberal era has been, in that our imaginations have been completely financialized as well. We can't seem to think beyond these, having to earn money and then spend it, and on one hand, it's because like this colonization of our imaginations. On the other hand, too, it's because austerity has forced people to obsess and fixate on this so much, just to stay afloat. And that's for no fault of people's at all, but it's kind of limited what we can imagine is possible. And something that I one of my favorite parts in the article is where we speak on what the real deficits that matter are, right? It's not the government deficit, which is what it spends into the economy that it doesn't tax back, but it's rather the deficit in clean air, the deficit in access to healthcare, the deficit in resources for mental health, the deficit for quality education, the deficit for meaningful work. There's a huge deficit in all of these things. So why don't we talk about that? Like, that deficit is only growing, and that deficit actually affects and impacts people's lives on the regularly, to the point where the cost and the social cost of not addressing these things is only getting worse and is only being exacerbated by climate change. And so that's where like this other piece comes in, as to, going full circle now to a question I was asked a while back: why the federal jobs guarantee? And that's kind of part of this broader understanding that climate change and the economy that is based on fossil fuels and extraction have not just put us in a situation where the planet is getting warmer, and that's disturbing all of these ecosystems and putting us in danger, but also that has specifically targeted and harmed various communities around the world, whether that be the developing world. So right now, for example, Colombia, my country, is a place that many international mining corporations are just like sucking out all of this value and natural resources, and that's leading to this ecological crisis. It's absolutely awful, and also the social crisis of corruption and impunity that exists to be able to maintain this system, right? And then here in the United States, you have the fact and the reality that pollution and the effects of climate change, such as Hurricane Katrina, for example, affects communities of color disproportionately, and it also correlates with poverty. It's just the entire design of this economy that is producing climate change, and the consequences of this have really devastated indigenous communities and people of color, women, you name it, right? And so this Green New Deal is an attempt to address both the immediate consequences of climate change and also the system that produced those in the first place. And so by doing so, some people talk about a just transition, and I think that's a really, really important part of this Green New Deal, and something that Alexandria has been also very committed to, which is to say, if we're going to transition to a new kind of renewable economy, it needs to be based on justice, and it needs to recognize the harm that this system has caused on so many people. And so this is kind of about putting jobs and work and the economy back into the hands of people all across communities, and in such a way where economic growth no longer depends on this kind of toxic and destructive growth model, but rather a qualitative kind of growth, a growth that is far more empowering, and that lifts people out of a very unjust situation and into a place of dignity. And this is something that's flying right over the head of most neoliberal economists, because they think that this is just everybody trying to fit all the progressive goals in one thing. What they seem incapable of doing is to realize that poverty and environmental destruction and racial injustice and gender inequality, that is all connected. I mean, it's all part of this one system that is destroying everything. So that's the idea. And I think I was having a conversation with Bob Hockett, who, of course, here in the United States, he's playing a critical role in the development of the Green New Deal.
I'm so glad you brought him up, because the appearance on Fox on Tucker Carlson was amazing.
Yeah.
And he did such a great job. But there are some hilariously bad takes from the Fox fans coming back at Bob. But anyway, hopefully you can talk about those.
Bob's great, yeah. So we were having this conversation last night about how, in an attempt to improve from the legacy of the first New Deal and some of the legacy of the original welfare state model, the Green New Deal is really, in a way, opening up space for there to be a significant expansion in public deliberation in communities on the ground, being able to organize and have discussion about what they need in order to thrive and in order to live dignified lives. So this is an attempt, I think, also to democratize the state itself, which is key, because as a progressive and as somebody that identifies as a democratic socialist, I don't believe in traditional top-down models for everything either. I think that it is important to have conversations about keeping the power of the state in check, in the same way that we're trying to keep the power of private profit and corporations and private actors in check as well. So a lot of the Green New Deal is allowing for people to organize locally and have these discussions. There are opportunities to introduce ideas such as participatory budgeting, for example, for communities to be able to vote on how they use the resources from the Green New Deal. And then also, too, the federal jobs guarantee, which has the element of being a part of a just transition, insofar that it guarantees the right to a dignified job. On top of that, as we know, the federal jobs guarantee is something that's locally administered. So once again, this is an opportunity for communities to come together and coordinate through the financing by the central government, by the federal government, to be able to do what only they know that they need to do. And so I think that this is like a real quandary for a lot of right wingers that see the world in a binary sometimes, and even some people on the left, I guess I would say, that's kind of like, that assumes that the only thing we can do is the world exists in either private or public. It's this kind of illusion of a binary, that either the government expands into the market or it contracts and gets smaller. But that's not really the way it works at all, right? Government and private actors and markets have always, since the very beginning of industrialization, capitalism, have always kind of been connected. And so the question is really about how do we want them to be connected, and for who do we want it to serve, and how do we want to organize these things, right? And so, yeah, our efforts are also to empower people at the local level.
I think that's what we need, partly because, here I think part of the attraction of the UBI is because, and I think this is as prevalent in the States as it is in the UK, that the government is seen as this kind of tyrannical force, pushing, forcing you to do something that you don't want to do. And here, I think the effect of that is twofold, in that we've had a government that has presented work as the way out of poverty, and at the same time made it really hard to get well-paid jobs.
Yeah, I get supply side economics, basically, just blaming the poor.
Yeah, the reality is an incredibly cruel situation where people are blamed for their own poverty and at the same time being made to work. So there is this perception that central government is tyrannical, and the feeling is justified. So this idea of decentralizing the way the jobs are picked and including the community to decide how best to use the resources from the Green New Deal, I think is key to engage people who have, for the most part, felt completely disengaged from the work that they do.
Absolutely. I think that's the future of building a democratic left that has more of a vision than a reliance on the past, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Andrés, we don't want to take up too much more of your time. I was thinking, I ask everybody this. I hate the word elevator pitch because nobody ever buys anything on an elevator. But yeah, I think you know what I mean. I wondered what if there's more than one answer to this. I'm fine with that. But what are your ways of getting people interested in MMT?
I think that there's something attractive about proposing that what we've been taught about the way our government works and the way banks and finance works is wrong, and that we are at a point where not only are we challenging all of these establishment people politically. Establishment people who rely on lobbyists and big money and simply have these centrist ideals. Establishment people, like Tony Blair, that took us to war. Not only
you took us to war, wasn't that?
Oh, yes, right. They took us to war.
Yeah, who's we?
So we're doing all this work to challenge these establishment people who sometimes even call themselves center left or liberal or whatever. And so, my pitch a lot of times is to say, if we're doing that politically, well, then we also need to do that with the way we think about economics. And there's no other way around that.
The one last thing I want to mention, actually, is that I've been having great fun reading all these op-eds on MMT and the Green New Deal from US news outlets. But I read one recently that actually made a case of saying the Green New Deal will not solve climate change. And the sole reason they gave for this was that basically a Green New Deal in the US wasn't enough to solve the whole of climate change. So the argument seemed to be, what's the point of doing it
That's just been out there forever, hasn't it? That talking point of like, well, as soon as you start talking about like, well, maybe we should reduce emissions, or well, what about China?
Yeah, exactly.
China's doing it all.
But
India's doing it all.
What they don't know is that there are, groups like Andrés and the Modern Money Network, and popping up in various places right now, trying to push these ideas forward, and hopefully we'll have it soon on the Labour Party in the UK, with any luck.
This is part of international solidarity.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you very much for joining us, Andrés. I'm so grateful that you managed to join us at such short notice.
It was my pleasure. It was a lot of fun.
And I've got a lot of marriage proposals from friends towards Alexandria. If you want to, pass them
their way.
Yeah. I know she has a partner, but you never know.
Okay, this is turning into a different podcast.
Yeah,
I'm just being a good friend.
Okay, so just one more thing. Is there a place you would like our listeners to go to on the internet?
I would say, check out the New Consensus. That is a kind of a think tank that's doing some work on the Green New Deal. I would say, get involved in the Modern Money Network if you haven't already. Check us out online as well. I think that's about it.
Great, that's enough.
And me on Twitter.
Yes, what's your handle?
It's Andrés in Theory, because I exist in theory on Twitter.
Andrés in Theory.
So it's Andrés, Andres, in theory.
All right. Well, Andrés, thank you in reality for talking to us.
The pleasure is all mine.
Okay. Well, hopefully we'll do this again. Thank you so much.
Good. Talk soon.
That was the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. You can get in touch with us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, or I'm at Christ Riley, spelled ChristReilly. And Patricia is at Patricia N. Pino, spelled PatriciaNPino. You can also email me at christriley@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.
This is spending in the world and we know it. This is spending in the world and we know it. This is spending in the world and we know it.
We're challenging.
Oh, wait a second. We missed a golden opportunity to call Tony Blair a war criminal. So let's just call Tony Blair a war criminal.
Let's just take a moment to do that. Right.
Okay, there we go. That's 3 votes. Right, to the Hague.
I agree.
Agree. 100%.